The December wind howled through the empty streets of Manhattan's Upper East Side, where Christmas lights twinkled in every window of the towering brownstones. Inside one of these magnificent homes, Harrison Wells stood before the grand fireplace of his study, swirling a glass of aged scotch as he contemplated the empire he'd built and the emptiness that came with it. At 58, Harrison was the CEO of Wells Enterprises, one of New York's most prominent real estate development companies. The firm's success had brought him everything money could buy: the finest clothes, luxurious cars, and this magnificent 5-story brownstone. But tonight, as the flames cast dancing shadows across his face, none of it seemed to matter. "Another Christmas alone?" he muttered, glancing at the oversized family portrait above the fireplace. His wife Elizabeth's smile seemed to mock him from within the gilded frame. 5 years had passed since cancer took her, leaving him with their daughter Sophie, now 25 and living in London, too busy with her own life to come home for the holidays. The sharp ring of his phone cut through his brooding. The caller ID showed Sophie's name, and Harrison's heart lifted momentarily. "Sophie, sweetheart, are you calling about Christmas?" There was a pause on the line. "Dad, I'm sorry. The firm needs me here. We're closing a major deal, and I can't—" "Of course," Harrison interrupted, his voice carefully controlled. "The deal comes first. I understand." After hanging up, Harrison walked to his office window, watching the snow begin to fall. The streets below were nearly empty, save for a small figure huddled in the doorway of the closed bakery across the street. Harrison squinted through the gathering darkness. It appeared to be a boy, no more than 12 or 13, trying to stay warm in what looked like a threadbare coat. Something about the scene struck Harrison. Perhaps it was the scotch, or the loneliness, or the ghost of Elizabeth's compassion that still haunted these halls. But he found himself reaching for his coat. "Mr. Wells," his housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, appeared in the doorway. "Is everything all right?" "I'm just stepping out for a moment," he replied, already heading for the door. The bitter cold hit him like a physical force as he crossed the street. The boy looked up as Harrison approached, revealing a face that was both wary and wise beyond its years. Despite the cold and his circumstances, there was something dignified in the way he held himself. "Good evening," Harrison said, trying to sound casual. "It's quite cold out here. Would you like to come inside for some hot chocolate?" The boy studied him with intelligent brown eyes. "My foster mom always said not to go with strangers," he replied, his voice clear and articulate despite his chattering teeth. Harrison felt an unexpected smile tugging at his lips. "Smart advice. I'm Harrison Wells, and I live in that house right there." He pointed to his brownstone. "My housekeeper. Mrs. Chen makes the best hot chocolate in Manhattan. You can see her through the window if you'd like to verify I'm telling the truth." The boy glanced at the warmly lit windows, then back at Harrison. "I'm Marcus Thompson," he said finally. "And I guess I could use something warm to drink." As they crossed the street together, Harrison noticed Marcus taking in every detail of his surroundings with keen interest. The boy's observant nature reminded him of himself at that age, always analyzing, always calculating possibilities. Inside, Mrs. Chen's eyes widened at the sight of their unexpected guest, but she quickly recovered, her natural warmth taking over as she ushered Marcus toward the kitchen. "You poor thing, you're frozen through. Let's get you warmed up right away." As Marcus sat at the kitchen island, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of hot chocolate, Harrison found himself studying the boy more closely. Despite his worn clothes and obvious hardship, there was a sharp intelligence in his eyes and a certain poise in his manner that seemed incongruous with his circumstances. "So, Marcus," Harrison began, settling onto a stool across from him, "what brings you to this neighborhood?" Marcus took a careful sip before answering. "Research, actually. I've been studying the local businesses, trying to understand why some succeed and others fail. The bakery across the street, for example. It closed because they couldn't compete with the chain stores, but I think they made some strategic mistakes." Harrison's eyebrows shot up. "Strategic mistakes?" Marcus nodded earnestly. They focused too much on trying to match the chain store's prices instead of emphasizing what made them unique. Their European-style pastries were amazing, but they buried that unique selling point trying to sell ordinary muffins and cookies at lower margins. Harrison felt his professional interest piqued. That's remarkably astute analysis for someone your age. How did you come to that conclusion? I talked to the former employees, looked at their old menus, and compared their prices and products with successful independent bakeries in other neighborhoods, Marcus explained, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for a 12-year-old to conduct market research. I like to understand how businesses work. My current foster parents think it's weird, but... He trailed off, and Harrison caught a glimpse of sadness beneath the boy's composed exterior. Your foster parents, they're not treating you well. Marcus shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant but not quite succeeding. They're okay. They provide food and shelter, but they don't really understand me. They think I should be playing video games instead of reading business journals. And they're talking about sending me back to the group home after the holidays anyway. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. Harrison felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since Elizabeth was alive, the desire to help, to make a difference in someone's life. As Marcus finished his hot chocolate, Harrison made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Mrs. Chen, he called out, please prepare the guest room. I think Marcus should stay with us tonight. It's much too cold out there. The boy's head snapped up, hope and suspicion warring in his eyes. Really? But why would you do that? Harrison met Marcus's gaze steadily. Because sometimes, Marcus, the best business decision is also the right thing to do. And I think you and I have a lot we could learn from each other. What Harrison didn't say, what he barely admitted to himself, was that looking at Marcus felt like looking at a mirror of his younger self, but one who still had the chance to learn the lessons that had taken Harrison a lifetime to understand. As Mrs. Chen led Marcus upstairs, Harrison returned to his study, picked up his phone, and began making calls. By morning, the wheels would be in motion to change both their lives forever. But neither of them could have predicted just how profound that change would be, or how it would transform not just their lives, but the very nature of Wells Enterprises itself. Will young Marcus transform Wells Enterprises with his unique vision? And can Harrison learn to open his heart again? Stay until the end to witness a Christmas miracle that will remind you what truly matters in life. The next morning, Harrison woke earlier than usual, his mind already racing with plans and possibilities. As he descended the stairs, the aroma of fresh coffee and breakfast filled the air, along with something else he hadn't heard in years, the sound of laughter coming from his kitchen. He paused in the doorway, taking in the unexpected scene. Marcus sat at the kitchen island, enthusiastically explaining something to Mrs. Chen while she prepared breakfast, her usually stoic face brightened by an amused smile. So, if they had focused on their specialty items and created an experience around them, they could have charged premium prices, Marcus was saying. Like that French bakery in the West Village. They don't compete on price, they compete on uniqueness and quality. I see you're already solving the world's business problems, Harrison said, announcing his presence. Marcus straightened slightly but didn't look embarrassed. Good morning, Mr. Wells. I was just explaining to Mrs. Chen why that bakery across the street could have survived. Indeed. Harrison sat down, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Chen. And what would you have done differently? Marcus's eyes lit up at the question. First, I would have created a signature line of European pastries they couldn't find anywhere else. Then I would have redesigned the store to feel more like a Paris cafe. Make it an experience, not just a place to buy bread. People will pay more for an experience. Harrison nodded, impressed despite himself. That's actually quite similar to what my company did with a struggling boutique hotel chain last year. We rebranded it as a luxury boutique experience and doubled the revenue. The Carlton Heights project? Marcus asked eagerly. I read about that in the Wall Street Journal. The article said you preserved the historic architecture while modernizing the amenities. It was brilliant because you kept what made each property unique while standardizing the quality of service. Harrison nearly choked on his coffee. You read the Wall Street Journal? Every day, Marcus replied matter-of-factly. The library near my foster home has a subscription. I also follow business news online when I can use the computers there. Before Harrison could respond, his phone buzzed. It was his lawyer, Richard Morton. "Excuse me," he said, stepping into the hallway to take the call. "Harrison," Richard's voice was careful, measured. "I've looked into the situation with the boy. It's complicated." Harrison's jaw tightened. "Explain." "Marcus Thompson has been in the foster system since he was 6. His parents died in a car accident. He's been through 4 foster homes in the last 6 years. His current placement isn't working out, as you suspected, but there's more. The boy is, different. Different how? His IQ tests are off the charts. He was recommended for several gifted programs, but none of his foster families followed through. There are notes from teachers about his unusual interest in business and economics, but also concerns about his difficulty connecting with peers. Some suggested he might be on the autism spectrum, though he was never formally evaluated." Harrison glanced back toward the kitchen, where Marcus was now explaining something to Mrs. Chen, using a napkin and a salt shaker as props. "What about adoption possibilities?" "That's another issue. Several families have shown interest over the years, but Marcus has, well, he's scared them off. He asks too many questions, challenges everything. One potential family said he presented them with a PowerPoint presentation about why they weren't financially stable enough to adopt him, despite the seriousness of the situation." Harrison felt a smile tugging at his lips. "He made a PowerPoint presentation. At age 10, Richard confirmed. "Harrison, are you seriously considering what I think you're considering? Because if you are, you need to know what you're getting into. This isn't a typical child." "No," Harrison agreed, watching Marcus gesture animatedly about something. "He's extraordinary." After ending the call, Harrison returned to the kitchen with a decision forming in his mind. But before he could speak, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Sophie. "Dad!" Her voice was tense. "Why is Richard calling me about adoption paperwork?" Harrison sighed. He'd hoped to have this conversation in person, but, "Sophie, something unexpected has happened. I need you to listen with an open mind." As he explained about Marcus, Sophie's initial skepticism gave way to confusion, then concern. "Dad, you can't just adopt a random boy off the street. What do you even know about him? This isn't like buying a company. You can't just do due diligence and make an acquisition." "Sophie," Harrison interrupted gently, "when was the last time you heard me laugh?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "What?" "This morning. I heard laughter in our house for the first time since your mother died." "Real laughter, Sophie, and it wasn't just Mrs. Chen. I found myself smiling too. This boy, he reminds me of myself at that age, but better. Smarter, more compassionate. He has the business acumen I had, but none of the ruthlessness I developed. He sees opportunities not just for profit, but for improvement." There was a long pause on the line. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" "I am. But Sophie, this isn't about replacing you or trying to fill a void. This is about giving a remarkable young man a chance to reach his full potential. And maybe about giving me a chance to be better too." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll be on the next flight to New York," Sophie said finally. "If you're really doing this, I need to meet him myself." After hanging up, Harrison returned to the kitchen to find Marcus and Mrs. Chen deep in discussion about the possibility of starting a small catering business focusing on authentic Chinese cuisine. "Marcus," Harrison said, drawing the boy's attention, "we need to talk about your future." Marcus's face immediately became guarded, the enthusiasm draining away. "You're sending me back, aren't you? It's okay. I understand. Thank you for letting me stay the night." "Actually," Harrison said carefully, "I was wondering how you'd feel about staying permanently." Marcus froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "What?" I've spoken with my lawyer this morning. There would be a lot of paperwork, interviews, home studies. It wouldn't happen overnight, but if you're interested, I'd like to adopt you." Marcus set down his fork with deliberate care. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because in less than 24 hours, you've already made this house feel more alive than it has in years," Harrison replied honestly. "Because you have an extraordinary mind that deserves to be nurtured, and because I think we could help each other become better versions of ourselves." Marcus studied Harrison's face with an intensity that would have made many adults uncomfortable. "You should know," he said finally, "that I have some conditions." Harrison raised an eyebrow, fighting back a smile. "Conditions?" Marcus nodded solemnly. "First, I want to be involved in the business. Not just learning about it, but really involved. I have ideas about how Wells Enterprises could incorporate more sustainable and community-focused development practices while maintaining profitability." "Go on," Harrison said, increasingly intrigued. "Second, if this works out, I want to start a foundation that helps other foster kids develop their potential. There are so many smart kids in the system who just need a chance." And third, Marcus's composure cracked slightly, revealing a glimpse of the vulnerable child beneath the precocious exterior. "Third, I want this to be real, not just on paper. If you're going to be my father, I need you to really be my father, even when I make mistakes or disagree with you or don't live up to expectations." Harrison felt something in his chest tighten. He walked around the island and for the first time pulled Marcus into a hug. The boy stiffened for a moment before gradually relaxing into the embrace. "Those aren't conditions, Marcus," Harrison said softly. "Those are promises, and I intend to keep all of them." Neither of them noticed Mrs. Chen quietly wiping tears from her eyes as she slipped out of the kitchen. But both of them knew that this moment marked the beginning of something extraordinary, a transformation that would reshape not just their lives, but the very foundation of everything Harrison had built. Your subscription helps us share stories that warm hearts and change lives. Hit subscribe now and join our family of dreamers and believers. Sophie Wells stood in the doorway of her childhood home, her designer suitcase forgotten at her feet as she took in the scene before her. The normally austere living room had been transformed. A massive Christmas tree dominated one corner, while scattered papers and books, some clearly belonging to a child, covered the usually immaculate coffee table. But what truly stopped her in her tracks was the sound of her father's laughter echoing from his study. Following the sound, she found Harrison Wells seated behind his desk, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, looking more relaxed than she'd seen him in years. Across from him sat a young boy with an intense expression, methodically explaining something using a tablet. "So if we implement these green building standards in the new development," Marcus was saying, "we'll qualify for tax incentives that offset the initial cost. Plus, the long-term energy savings and positive PR will increase property values." "But what about the immediate impact on our profit margins?" Harrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Marcus's eyes lit up. "That's the brilliant part. I've run the numbers." He stopped abruptly, noticing Sophie in the doorway. His posture immediately shifted, becoming more guarded. "Sophie!" Harrison rose, embracing his daughter. "I'm so glad you're here." "Sophie, this is Marcus. Marcus, this is my daughter, Sophie." Marcus stood, extending his hand with a formality that seemed both endearing and slightly absurd in someone so young. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ms. Wells. I've read about your work with sustainable investment strategies in London. Your approach to environmental, social, and governance criteria is quite innovative." Sophie blinked, taken aback. This was not what she'd expected. "Thank you," she said slowly, studying the boy who had so captivated her father. "Please, call me Sophie." Before the conversation could continue, Mrs. Chen appeared. "Dinner is ready," she announced, her eyes twinkling with unusual excitement. "Marcus helped plan the menu." Over dinner, Sophie watched in growing amazement as her father and Marcus engaged in a detailed discussion about business ethics and sustainable development. It wasn't just Marcus's obvious intelligence that struck her. It was how he seemed to bring out a side of Harrison Wells she hadn't seen since her mother was alive. But as the meal progressed, Sophie noticed something else. Beneath Marcus's impressive vocabulary and business acumen, there were moments when his age showed through. A slight tremor in his voice when discussing his ideas. The way his eyes would dart to Harrison for approval. The careful way he ate as if afraid of making a mistake. After dinner, while Marcus was helping Mrs. Chen with the dishes, something Sophie couldn't remember any guest ever doing, she confronted her father in his study. "Dad, he's remarkable, I'll give you that. But are you sure you know what you're getting into? Being a parent isn't like running a company." Harrison's face softened. "Do you know what Marcus said to me this morning? He said he wanted to start a foundation to help other foster children develop their potential, not to help himself, to help others. He's 12 years old, Sophie, and he's thinking about how to make the world better." "That's exactly what I mean," Sophie pressed. "He's so different. What happens when the novelty wears off, when he's a teenager and starts rebelling, when he makes mistakes or doesn't live up to these incredible expectations? Then I'll be there for him," Harrison said simply. "Just like I was there for you." Sophie felt tears pricking at her eyes. "Were you? Dad, after Mom died, you buried yourself in work. You barely noticed when I moved to London." Harrison's face fell. "Sophie, No, let me finish. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because if you're going to be a father to Marcus, you need to be better than you were with me. He's already been abandoned once. He can't..." She was interrupted by a small sound from the doorway. Marcus stood there, his face pale, a stack of business journals clutched to his chest like a shield. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to interrupt. Marcus, wait," Sophie called. But the boy was already gone, his footsteps racing up the stairs. Harrison moved to follow, but Sophie stopped him. "Let me," she said softly. "Please." She found Marcus in the guest room, his room now she supposed, sitting cross-legged on the bed, surrounded by financial reports and business magazines. He didn't look up as she entered. "You don't have to worry," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I understand if this isn't going to work out. I can have my things packed in 10 minutes. Sophie's heart broke a little at how quickly he assumed rejection. She sat on the edge of the bed, careful to give him space. "That's not why I'm here, Marcus. I came to apologize." That got his attention. He looked up, confusion evident in his eyes. "I was wrong to question my father's decision without getting to know you first," Sophie continued. "And I was especially wrong to have that conversation where you might overhear it. That wasn't fair to you." Marcus studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. "But you were right," he said finally. "I am different. I know that. The other foster families, they all said so. Too intense, too serious, too much." His voice cracked slightly. "Different isn't bad," Sophie said gently. "Look at me. I left a promising career in New York to start over in London because I wanted to focus on sustainable investment. Everyone said I was crazy to walk away from a partner track position, but I followed my heart, and now I'm doing work that matters." Marcus absorbed this, his fingers absently straightening the papers around him. "Your father, he's different too, isn't he? Since your mom died?" Sophie nodded, surprised by his perception. "Yes, he is. But you know what? Since you arrived, I've seen glimpses of the father I remember from before. The one who used to get excited about ideas, who cared about more than just profit margins." "Really?" Hope crept into Marcus's voice. "Really?" Sophie smiled, reaching out to straighten one of his papers. "And between you and me, I think your ideas about sustainable development are exactly what Wells Enterprises needs. We've been too focused on short-term profits for too long." Marcus's eyes lit up. "I have a whole presentation about that. Would you like to see it? I've been researching successful green building projects and their long-term impact on both profitability and community development. Sophie laughed, but it was warm rather than mocking. I would love to see it. But first, can we talk about something else? Tell me about you, not your business ideas. Just you. What do you like to do for fun? For a moment, Marcus looked panicked, as if the question was harder than any business problem he'd ever tackled. Then, slowly, he reached under his pillow and pulled out a worn notebook. Sometimes I write stories, he admitted, about kids like me. But in the future, they run ethical businesses that help people and save the environment. Is that stupid? Sophie felt tears welling up again, but this time they were different. No, Marcus, she said softly. That's not stupid at all. In fact, I'd love to hear one of your stories. As Marcus hesitantly began to share his story about a former foster kid who revolutionized sustainable housing, Sophie sent a quick text to her father. You're right about him, he's extraordinary, but he needs us, all of us, to be extraordinary too. In his study, Harrison read the message and smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. But none of them could have predicted the challenges that lay ahead, as the worlds of high finance and family love were about to collide in ways that would test them all. If this story is touching your heart, give it a like. Every like helps us reach more people with messages of hope and transformation. 2 weeks had passed since Sophie's arrival, and the Wells household had settled into an unexpected rhythm. The adoption process was moving forward, with Harrison's lawyers navigating the complexities of the system. But it was the morning of the Wells Enterprises board meeting that would truly test their newfound family dynamic. Harrison stood in his closet, adjusting his tie, when he heard a knock at his bedroom door. Marcus stood there, already dressed in a perfectly pressed suit that Mrs. Chen had helped him select, a miniature version of Harrison's own attire. Are you sure about this? Marcus asked, his voice steady, but his hands fidgeting with his sleeve cuffs. The board might not take kindly to having a kid present their new strategic initiative. Harrison knelt down to fix Marcus's tie. They need to hear this from you. You developed the proposal, you ran the numbers, and you understand the vision better than anyone. Besides, you're not just any kid, you're my son. The words still felt new on Harrison's tongue, but the smile it brought to Marcus's face made any awkwardness worth it. Sophie met them at the breakfast table, also dressed for battle in a sharp business suit. She had extended her stay in New York, determined to support both her father and her new brother in what they all knew would be a challenging presentation. Remember, Sophie coached as they ate, Uncle James will be your biggest obstacle. He's never liked change, and he has significant influence over the other board members. Marcus nodded seriously. James Blackwood, board vice chairman, holds 15% of company shares. Traditional real estate developer, opposed the last 3 attempts at modernizing company strategy. Harrison and Sophie exchanged impressed looks at Marcus's thorough research. Just stick to the facts, Harrison advised. The numbers don't lie. But as they entered the Wells Enterprises headquarters, Harrison felt a knot forming in his stomach. The boardroom was already full, and the atmosphere was tense. James Blackwood sat at the far end of the table, his face set in familiar lines of disapproval. Harrison, James began before they could even sit down. What's the meaning of this? This is a board meeting, not a family outing. Marcus is here to present a new strategic initiative, Harrison replied calmly. One that could redefine Wells Enterprises for the next generation. James's eyebrows shot up. You're letting a child present to the board. Have you lost your mind? Uncle James, Sophie interrupted smoothly, I've reviewed Marcus's proposal in detail. As someone who specializes in sustainable investment, I can assure you it's worth hearing. Marcus stepped forward, his tablet connected to the room's display system. Despite his obvious nervousness, his voice was clear and confident as he began. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, Wells Enterprises stands at a crossroads. Our traditional development model has served us well, but the market is changing. Today, I present a comprehensive strategy for transitioning to sustainable, community-focused development while maintaining and ultimately increasing our profit margins. For the next 30 minutes, Marcus laid out his vision. He presented case studies, financial projections, and detailed implementation plans. He showed how incorporating green building standards and community spaces could qualify them for tax incentives while increasing property values. He demonstrated how their existing projects could be retrofitted to reduce operating costs. The board members leaned forward, their initial skepticism giving way to interest. Even James Blackwood stopped frowning and started taking notes. But then came the questions. These environmental upgrades will cut deeply into our immediate profits, James argued. Our shareholders expect consistent returns. Marcus didn't hesitate. Actually, Mr. Blackwood, I've analyzed the shareholder patterns of companies that have made similar transitions. While there's typically a small dip in the first 2 quarters, by year's end, share values increase an average of 23% due to increased investor confidence and positive market perception. I can show you the data. That's all very well, James interrupted. But what about our existing contracts, our suppliers, our contractors? You're talking about completely disrupting our established business relationships. I've thought of that too, Marcus replied, switching to a new slide. I've identified suppliers who can provide sustainable materials at competitive prices. Many of our current contractors are already certified in green building practices. Those who aren't have expressed interest in certification programs, which we could partially subsidize to maintain those relationships while upgrading our capabilities. James's face reddened. This is absurd. Harrison, you can't seriously be considering restructuring our entire company based on the ideas of a child you picked up off the street. The room fell silent. Harrison felt his hands clench into fists, but before he could respond, Marcus spoke again. His voice was quieter now, but somehow more powerful. You're right, Mr. Blackwood. I am a child from the street. I've seen firsthand what happens in communities when developers only care about profit. I've watched small businesses die and families get displaced, but I've also seen what happens when development is done right, when it lifts up communities instead of destroying them. He switched to his final slide, showing a familiar street corner. This was my last foster home's neighborhood. That empty lot used to be a community garden. That boarded-up building was a family-owned grocery store. They're gone now because a developer, not Wells Enterprises, but someone like us, decided quick profits were more important than community value. Marcus's voice grew stronger, more passionate. But imagine if we did it differently. Imagine if we built developments that people were proud to live in, that made communities stronger, that showed the world that profit and purpose can go hand in hand. That's not just good ethics. It's good business. The room was silent for a long moment after Marcus finished. Harrison held his breath, watching the board members exchange glances. Then, to everyone's surprise, it was James Blackwood who spoke first. I have another question, he said, his voice gruff but somehow different. These community spaces you're proposing, the urban gardens, the small business incubators, how do you plan to manage them long-term? Marcus's eyes lit up. Actually, sir, I have a detailed operations plan for that too. Would you like to see it? As Marcus pulled up more slides, Harrison sat back feeling a profound sense of pride. He caught Sophie's eye across the table and she gave him a small nod. They both knew they were watching something extraordinary unfold, but neither of them could have predicted what would happen next, as James Blackwood rose from his chair with an announcement that would change everything. Want more stories that inspire and move you? Subscribe now. Turn on notifications to never miss a moment of magic. James Blackwood stood slowly, his expression unreadable. The boardroom fell silent, waiting. He straightened his tie, looked directly at Marcus, and said something that stunned everyone present. I'd like to pledge $10 million of my personal investment portfolio to seed the community development fund this young man is proposing. Harrison nearly dropped his pen. Sophie's mouth fell open. Marcus stood frozen at the front of the room, his tablet forgotten in his hands. 20 years ago, James continued, his voice rougher than usual, my father sat in this very room and told the board that Wells Enterprises needed to change with the times. We didn't listen. We were too focused on quick profits, too afraid of innovation. He paused, looking around the room. Today, I heard my father's voice again, coming from a 12-year-old boy who sees what we've all been too blind to see. James walked around the table until he stood directly in front of Marcus. Young man, you reminded me today of why I got into this business in the first place. It wasn't just about making money, it was about building something meaningful. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. One by one, other board members began to speak up. The CFO pointed out that their current investors had been pushing for more sustainable initiatives. The head of operations admitted that their traditional development model was becoming increasingly difficult to justify to younger buyers. Within an hour, the board had unanimously approved Marcus's proposal, with the additional backing of James's seed funding. As the board members filed out, many stopping to shake Marcus's hand, Harrison noticed his son's hands trembling slightly. The moment the last person left, Marcus's professional composure cracked. He turned to Harrison with tears in his eyes. Did that really just happen? He whispered. Harrison pulled him into a tight hug. It really did, son. You did it. We did it, Marcus corrected, his voice muffled against Harrison's suit jacket. As a family. Sophie joined the hug, creating a moment that felt both completely new and somehow perfectly natural. When they finally separated, Harrison noticed James Blackwood still lingering by the door. Harrison, James said, might I have a word with your son? Privately? Harrison looked at Marcus, who nodded bravely. As Harrison and Sophie stepped outside, James sat down next to Marcus. There's something else you should know, James said quietly. That community garden you mentioned, the one that was destroyed. I was the developer who bought that property. Marcus stiffened, but James held up a hand. Please let me finish. When I saw that property, all I saw were numbers on a spreadsheet. I never thought about the people, the community, but seeing it through your eyes today, well, let's just say I'd like to make amends. He pulled out his phone, pulled up a map and showed it to Marcus. This is the property across from your old foster home. I still own it. How would you like to help me turn it back into something the community can be proud of? Marcus's eyes widened. You mean your first project? James smiled. Think you can handle it? Marcus's response was to pull out his tablet and immediately start sketching ideas, making James laugh in a way his fellow board members had never heard before. Outside the boardroom, Harrison and Sophie waited, both lost in their own thoughts. Dad, Sophie said suddenly, I'm moving back to New York. Harrison turned to her in surprise. But your job in London? I've already talked to my firm. They're excited about opening a New York office focused on sustainable development consulting. And, she smiled, I think my little brother might need some help with his ambitious plans. Harrison felt his heart swell with pride and love for both his children. Sophie, I know I haven't always been the father you deserved, Dad. Stop, Sophie interrupted gently. What matters is now. And right now, you're exactly the father both Marcus and I need you to be. The door opened, and Marcus burst out, his face glowing with excitement. Sophie, Mr. Blackwood wants me to redesign the community garden project, and he says you should be the sustainability consultant. Sophie laughed, ruffling his hair. Well, good thing I'm moving back then, isn't it? Marcus's jaw dropped. You're moving back? Really? We can work together? Really, Sophie confirmed. Someone has to keep you two in line. 1 year later, Christmas Eve. The Wells household buzzed with activity. The enormous Christmas tree sparkled with lights. But it was the warmth of the gathering beneath it that truly lit up the room. Mrs. Chen bustled about, serving her famous hot chocolate to a crowd that included James Blackwood, several board members, and most importantly, the residents of the newly completed community complex that had replaced the empty lot in Marcus's old neighborhood. In one corner, Sophie was explaining the solar panel installation, to a group of interested teenagers from the community. In another, Harrison watched as Marcus proudly showed James the urban farming program he'd developed for the building's rooftop garden. "Mr. Wells?" A small voice drew Harrison's attention. It was Lisa, one of the children from the complex. "Marcus told us that you found him on the street last Christmas." Harrison nodded, smiling at the memory. "That's right. He says it was the best Christmas gift ever," Lisa continued. "But he also says the real gift wasn't the adoption or the fancy house." "Oh?" Harrison was curious. "What does he say was the real gift?" "The chance to make a difference," Lisa replied. "He says you gave him the chance to help other people, and that's worth more than anything." Harrison felt tears pricking at his eyes as he watched Marcus move through the room, confidently discussing future projects with board members while making sure every child had cookies and hot chocolate. He was still the same brilliant business-minded boy Harrison had met a year ago, but now there was an ease to him, a joy that came from knowing he was exactly where he belonged. Later that night, after the guests had gone and Mrs. Chen had retired, Harrison found Marcus and Sophie in his study, poring over plans for their next project. "You two do realize it's Christmas Eve, right?" he teased. Marcus looked up, his eyes bright with the same passion Harrison had first seen a year ago, but now tempered with happiness. "We're just finishing up. Sophie had this amazing idea for incorporating educational spaces into the next development." Harrison sat down with his children, marveling at how natural it felt now. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "your mother would have loved this. Both of you, working together, using business to help people. It's exactly what she always said was possible." Sophie reached over and squeezed his hand. Marcus leaned against his shoulder. Through the window, snow began to fall, just as it had on that fateful night a year ago. But now, instead of loneliness, the Wells home was filled with purpose, love, and the unshakable bond of family. "Merry Christmas, Dad," Marcus said softly. "Thank you for giving me a chance." Harrison pulled both his children close. "No, Marcus, thank you, both of you, for giving me so much more than a chance. You gave me back my heart." Outside, the snow continued to fall on a city that was slowly changing, one compassionate business decision at a time. Inside, a family that had been forged by chance and strengthened by love celebrated not just Christmas, but the countless possibilities that lay ahead. Because sometimes the greatest gifts come in unexpected packages, and the truest measure of success isn't in profit margins or property values, but in the lives we touch and the changes we inspire. And in the heart of Manhattan, in a house that had once felt empty despite its grandeur, three people who had found each other against all odds celebrated the most precious gift of all, the gift of family, purpose, and the chance to make the world a little bit better, one project at a time. What would you do if you were Harrison? Would you have taken that chance on a stranger that cold Christmas night? How has someone's unexpected kindness changed your life forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story could inspire others. If this touched your heart, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. With your support, we can keep bringing you powerful stories of love, hope, and transformation every single day.